The worst deaths in every Arctic expedition. Drawn to disaster. The Arctic does not kill with drama. It kills with patience. It lowers the temperature 1 degree at a time. It closes the ice around a ship over the course of weeks. It takes fingers, then hands, then the ability to think clearly, then the will to continue moving. The men who died in the expeditions in this video were not underprepared by the standards of their time. They were the best equipped, best funded, most experienced explorers their nations could send. The Arctic killed them anyway. These are the worst deaths in every Arctic expedition. The Franklin Expedition, 1845. In May of 1845, the British Royal Navy dispatched 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, into the Canadian Arctic, under the command of Sir John Franklin, a 59-year-old naval officer and veteran Arctic explorer. The expedition carried 129 men, 3 years of provisions, a small library, fine china, and a hand organ. It was the most lavishly equipped Arctic expedition in British history. Its mission was to complete the Northwest Passage, the sea route through the Arctic archipelago, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The ships were last seen by European witnesses in late July of 1845, when 2 whaling vessels encountered them, anchored to an iceberg in Baffin Bay, waiting for conditions to improve. After that, silence. Search expeditions began in 1848. Over the following decade, more than 30 search missions were dispatched by Britain and the United States. None found survivors. What they found, gradually, over years, were fragments. A cairn on King William Island containing a note. The note, written in the margins of a standard Admiralty form, stated that HMS Erebus and HMS Terror had been trapped in the ice since September 12, 1847. It stated that Sir John Franklin had died on June 11, 1847. It stated that the remaining 105 men had abandoned the ships on April 22, 1848, and were attempting to walk south to the Back River, a distance of approximately 1,000 miles, across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. None of them made it. Inuit testimony, collected by subsequent expeditions, described seeing groups of men walking south, dragging heavy wooden boats on sledges across the ice. The men were described as thin, stumbling, and barely able to communicate. Some Inuit reported finding bodies in tents. Others described a boat containing 2 skeletons and a large quantity of equipment, silver plate, books, silk handkerchiefs, things that had no survival value but that the men had chosen to carry across the ice rather than abandon. Forensic analysis of skeletal remains found on King William Island in the 20th century revealed lead poisoning at levels consistent with chronic toxicity. The expedition's food tins had been sealed with lead solder. The men had been slowly poisoned by their own provisions for months before the ships became trapped. The lead poisoning would have caused confusion, paranoia, muscle weakness, and impaired decision-making, precisely when clear thinking was most needed. All 129 men died. The exact circumstances of the final deaths remain unknown. The last men alive walked into the Arctic and were never found. The Greely Expedition, 1881. In 1881, the United States Army Signal Corps dispatched Lieutenant Adolphus Greely and a party of 25 men to Lady Franklin Bay in the high Arctic as part of an international scientific effort known as the First International Polar Year. Their mission was meteorological and scientific observation. They established a base called Fort Conger at 81 degrees north latitude, further north than any American had previously wintered. The plan called for a relief ship to arrive in 1882 and again in 1883. Neither ship arrived as planned. The first relief expedition turned back due to ice. The second sank. Greely and his men waited at Fort Conger through a second Arctic winter, then a third, slowly consuming their provisions. In August of 1883, Greely made the decision to abandon Fort Conger and retreat south by boat toward a predetermined cache of supplies at Cape Sabine. The journey took weeks. When they arrived at Cape Sabine, they found the cache contained approximately 40 days of rations for 25 men who had already been on reduced rations for months and who faced another full Arctic winter. They built a hut from an overturned boat and waited. Men began dying in January of 1884. Sergeant David Lynn, died on January 18, 1884. Corporal William Cross died on February 9. Private Roderick Schneider died on March 24. The deaths accelerated as spring approached and rations disappeared entirely. By the time the rescue ship Thetis reached Cape Sabine on June 22, 1884, only 7 of the original 25 men remained alive. 18 had died of starvation, hypothermia, and related causes. 1 had been shot. Private Charles Henry had been executed by order of Lieutenant Greeley for repeatedly stealing food from the group's dwindling supply. Food that, if distributed equally, might have kept 1 additional man alive for several more days. When rescuers opened the survival hut, they found the 7 survivors in extreme states of physical deterioration. Several could not stand. 1 died shortly after rescue. Evidence found at the site suggested that some of the dead had been partially consumed by the survivors. Greeley denied the allegations for the rest of his life. Forensic evidence collected later confirmed them. 6 men survived the Greeley expedition. Adolphus Greeley lived until 1935. He was 91 years old. The André expedition, 1897. Solomon August André was a 42-year-old Swedish engineer who believed he could reach the North Pole by hydrogen balloon. In July of 1897, he and 2 companions, Nils Strindberg, 25 years old, and Knut Frankel, 26 years old, lifted off from Danes Island in Svalbard in a balloon called the Eagle. They carried pigeons for communication, a sledge, provisions, and photographic equipment. They expected to reach the North Pole within days and land somewhere in Russia or Canada. The balloon was last seen heading northeast over the Arctic Ocean. Then nothing. No word, no pigeons returned, no trace. For 33 years, the fate of the Andrea expedition was unknown. In August of 1930, a Norwegian scientific expedition landed on White Island, a remote, uninhabited island in the Arctic Ocean, rarely accessible due to ice, and found the camp. The bodies of all 3 men were discovered within a short distance of each other. Their equipment was intact. Their photographic film was recovered and developed. The photographs showed the men on the ice, apparently healthy, after the balloon had crashed. The balloon had come down on the ice approximately 65 hours after takeoff, having traveled only 475 miles, nowhere near the North Pole. The men had then walked across the Arctic ice for 3 months, hauling their equipment, covering approximately 300 miles toward land, before reaching White Island on October 5, 1897. They died within days of reaching land, all 3. The cause of death has never been conclusively determined. Theories include trichinosis, from eating undercooked polar bear meat, exposure, exhaustion, or carbon monoxide poisoning from their cook stove in an enclosed space. The photographs they took on the ice, developed 33 years after their deaths, show men who appear purposeful, organized, and unaware that they would not survive. Nils Strindberg had been engaged to be married before he left. His fiancée, Anna Charlier, waited for him for years before accepting his death and marrying another man. His last diary entry was written 2 days before he died. The Scott expedition returned from the South Pole. 1912, Robert Falcon Scott's expedition to the South Pole is technically Antarctic rather than Arctic, but it belongs in the canon of polar death by the same mechanisms: cold, exhaustion, starvation, and the failure of the environment to permit survival regardless of human effort. On January 17, 1912, Scott and 4 companions, Edward Wilson, Henry Bowers, Lawrence Oates, and Edgar Evans, reached the South Pole to find that Roald Amundson's Norwegian expedition had beaten them by 34 days. They turned around and began the 800-mile return journey in deteriorating conditions. Edgar Evans died first. He had sustained a head injury from a fall and was suffering from severe frostbite. He collapsed on February 17, 1912, and died at the base of the Beardmore Glacier. Lawrence Oates was suffering from frostbite, so severe that his feet had become gangrenous. He knew he was slowing the party down. On March 16, 1912, he walked out of the tent into a blizzard. His last words to the remaining 3 men were reported by Scott as, I am just going outside, and maybe sometime. He was never seen again. Scott, Wilson, and Bowers died together in their tent on or around March 29, 1912. They were 11 miles from a supply depot that contained food and fuel sufficient to have saved them. A blizzard had pinned them in their tent for 9 days. Scott's final diary entry, written with frozen fingers, ended with the words, "For God's sake, look after our people." Their tent was found by a search party on November 12, 1912. The 3 men were inside, in their sleeping bags. Scott's diary was recovered intact. The numbers. Since the beginning of organized Arctic and Antarctic exploration in the early 19th century, at least 1,500 men have died in polar expeditions. The causes are consistent across every era and every nationality: cold, starvation, scurvy, lead poisoning, mechanical failure, and the fundamental inability of the human body to sustain itself in an environment it was not designed to inhabit. The Franklin expedition killed 129 men and took 160 years to fully document through underwater archaeology. The Greely expedition killed 18 of 25 men and produced evidence of cannibalism that its sole surviving commander denied until his death at 91. The Andre Hay expedition killed 3 men on a remote island whose photographs were not developed for 33 years. Scott's polar party died 11 miles from safety. The cold does not negotiate. It does not respond to rank, experience, national pride, or the quality of the provisions. It lowers the temperature 1 degree at a time, and it waits. If you found this video useful, subscribe for more and leave your suggestions for the next video in the comments.